Hey, everybody. Now, before we kick off this episode, I just wanted to give a brief explanation. At about the halfway mark of the episode, there's a bit of a shift in tone and maybe a bit of a shift in the audio that you might hear. The reason for that is, unfortunately, the first time myself and John recorded, I ran into some major technical difficulties, which prevented us from continuing the chat. That was a few months back, and we had to rearrange, and myself and John managed to catch up probably about a month and a half ago now, and finish off the rest of the episode. As a result, there were some things that were repeated, as I wasn't sure how much of the initial recording I would be able to salvage. So this is a sort of combination of two conversations myself and John had, and I wanted to share both parts of it with you because I feel that there's a lot of important information that John is able to bring to us from both his past, his experience, and his view now, looking forwards, as well as what's occurring going forward with Economic Hitman from China, and also his new book that will be released next year that we mentioned during the episode as well. I hope you enjoy it. As always, drop your comments down below. Share the video if you can, share the podcast if you can, the episode, and I hope you enjoy it. And now over to myself and John as we continue the rest of the episode. Thank you very much. That's my cat. Bye. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Open Forum podcast. Today we have with us John Perkins. Now, John Perkins was the former chief economist at Chad Team Main, where that wasn't his only role. He'd also worked as an economic hitman, something that John's going to tell us a little bit more about in a moment. But following his work there, he went on to found his own energy company, which he attributes the success of with his silence after stepping out of working as an EHM, and then also founding the Dream Change charity and co-founder for the Pachamama Alliance, which are things that I'm sure we're going to touch on to over the course of the episode. However, John, welcome, first off, and can you maybe take 2 minutes to introduce yourself, and then after that, what exactly is an economic hitman, and then we're just going to roll on from there.
Well, thanks, Sonny. Yeah, I think you've already introduced me, but an economic hitman, as you mentioned, my official title was chief economist at this major international consulting firm that operated out of Boston, Massachusetts, all over the world. I had a staff that was 30 to at times 50 people, and my job was really to identify countries that had resources that corporations want, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. And the loan then would have to be used to hire US corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country, things like power plants and industrial parks and highways. These were things that made a lot of money for the companies that constructed them, the ones that were paid out of these loans. And they made a lot of money for a few wealthy families in the country, the families that owned the industries, the commercial establishments, the banks that benefited from better electricity or more electricity and highways and industrial parks, etc. But they were a bad deal for most everybody else because money was used, it was diverted from paying, it was diverted to pay interest on the loans, and it was diverted from education facilities, healthcare facilities, other social services that benefit everyone. So it was really a very bad deal for the country ultimately. However, we could show with our econometric models that it was a good deal for the country. It was very deceptive because you can show that when you invest a lot of money in infrastructure in a lower income country, the economy grows, the GDP, gross domestic product, increases. And I was taught in business school to believe that that meant the country prospered. And that's the selling point, the country prospers. But as I get into this deeper, I began to see that the country didn't prosper, that just a few individuals, a few families prospered. And that GDP is a lousy measure. It doesn't measure prosperity. It measures how well the rich are doing, basically. And that's true in the United States, too. Here we've got, for example, 3 individuals who have as much wealth as half the population of this country. If those 3 individuals made 10% on their wealth last year, and half the country lost 3%, and everybody else remained the same, you would show a growth rate of almost 4% in wealth. So it would look as though the country prospered, when the fact of the matter was only 3 individuals actually prospered. And if that's true in a country where 3 individuals own as much as half the population, what about countries where 3 individuals own as much as 90% of the population, you know? So, but this is not apparent to most people, and it wasn't apparent to me for a long time. So, and my job was to convince these countries to take these loans, put themselves into deep debt, hire our companies to build infrastructure projects for them. And in the long run, they couldn't pay off the principal on the loan. And so we'd go back in and say, since you can't pay your debts, sell your oil or whatever the resource was at cut rate prices without any environmental or social regulations, or with very few. Vote with us on the next United Nations vote that, against Cuba or whatever. Allow us to build a military base on your soil. Really what we were doing, Sonny, was colonizing the world. We were creating a global empire. And then we can call it an American empire, but it was really a corporate empire that was supported by the United States. And I will also say that these loans were attractive to leaders of countries because they and their friends and families would make a lot of money. We would produce reports that they could take to the press in their country, and they could tell their people, look, our economy is going to grow. And we could say and it was true based on the measures that we all were using. And on the other side of the coin, all of these, that's my cat's in the background if you hear.
I thought that was mine, so that's all right.
She wants to be on the program. Maybe she will be later.
They can make an appearance, yeah.
We had, behind me were people called jackals. And these are people that overthrow governments or assassinate leaders. They're usually CIA assets. And, unfortunately, she said, oh, you're talking about those jackals again. Fortunately, the United States has admitted to having these jackals participate in the overthrow and often the death of people like Allende of Chile and Mossadegh of Iran and Lumumba of the Congo and Diem of Vietnam and on and on and on. The list goes on. Most recently, Honduras in Honduras's Zelaya in 2009. So, you got a head of a state. You're the head of the state, Sonny, and I'm sitting in front of you, and basically I say, hey, I got a few $1 billion for you in this hand. If you don't take it, got a gun in this hand. I didn't have the gun, but I knew guys with guns were right behind me, and so did the leader. They are all aware of this.
I mean, that's one of the things that you mentioned as well in the original, or this is the new Confessions, but in Confessions, that there were also leaders that even if the coup attempt, the overthrow attempt had failed by the jackals, it was still enough to scare that leader into saying, you know what, screw it, I'm just going to roll with it. It wasn't an empty threat.
Yeah, that was, for example, I believe used in Ecuador with President Rafael Correa, where it was an attempted coup and it failed. And I think it intentionally failed, but he got a very strong message and changed his policies radically after that. I know Rafael, and he denies it, but of course you would deny it. And he points out there are other reasons for changing some of his policies, pressure from his own people, and so on. But yes, it's a very, very effective policy, and of course it's been used for thousands of years. This whole process goes back a long time, especially the jackals. Using debt and not the military is much more recent. That's become prevalent, especially prevalent since I became an economic hitman back in the 70s. In fact, Sonny, I talk in my new book about the 4 pillars of the economic hitman strategy. and they are fear of the other, whoever the other. We planted fear of communism. We've got to stop communism from coming into your country and destroying you and your presidency and so forth. And then there's debt, and I just described that. And then there's something called anxiety of insufficiency. So you're a very poor country, and you've got to be anxious about your status in the world, and the fact that many of your people are very, very poor and starving, and we'll help bring you out of that by using debt. And then the fourth one is divide and conquer. So join us, don't join the communist bloc. Today we say don't join the Chinese bloc. Yeah. And of course, this is being extremely exaggerated today by the invasion of Ukraine, where is vying for the world's, very active in Africa and Latin America right now, that many countries are not siding with the United States and NATO because they don't see that serving their interests. And of course, Russia is doing everything it can to make sure that that continues. So these four pillars, which have been around for centuries: fear, debt, anxiety over insufficiency, and divide and conquer. And in more recent times, we've increasingly switched to the debt and the fear of the anxiety over insufficiency and divide and conquer, and less use of military forces. But they're still there, as we well know today.
And so the reason that those things happened is because they refused to sign with you. So it's, I want to say carrot and stick, but stick doesn't quite outline hard enough what the other option is. So then we get to the situation where people decide not to play ball. And this is what you mentioned of having the jackals sitting over your shoulders, and where other admitted CIA coups have occurred in the past, whereby either yourself or colleagues have not been successful in trying to get a world leader on side to sign the papers to get these loans. How often do you think is it that this kind of thing happens, for one? And secondly, what for you, when you see these things happening, are telltale signs? So the reason that I ask that is so that we can then build up into that picture of Ukraine as well, with the 2014, 2015 transition from a leader who was almost pro-Russian into someone who is more pro-EU and pro-joining the UN and whatnot.
Yeah, well, how often does it happen? It is not that often, because when it does happen, every other world leader knows that it happened. And Roldos was not that one, but Torrijos was. Torrijos had become a hero around the world, standing up to the United States, and every leader in the world knew that he was negotiating with Carter. It was an open book on the canal, and he was being very strong about it, that this belongs to us. And he was being very strong about other things. Panama needs to be a free country. We can't be under the thumb of the United States. He was extremely well known. And so when he died the way he did, and then Roldos before him, it sent a message out to every other leader in the world who might be thinking about standing up to us, not to do it. And we recently had that, well, in 2009, it's not that recent anymore. President Zelaya was taken out. He wasn't killed, but he was taken out in a coup and went into hiding in another country. In 2009, he was the president of Honduras, who stood up to U.S. Corporate interests, primarily in the big businesses, and also raised the minimum wage of Honduras by 60%, which impacted a lot of U.S. corporations that had sweatshops there. So he was overthrown, and there was an attempt, and there was a movement in Ecuador and several other countries that would seem to be headed toward defying the United States. That stopped almost as soon as what happened in Honduras happened. The rest of the continent kind of fell in line a little bit more. They might be verbalizing opposition, but they weren't really doing very much. Ecuador was a good example, where it started to open up its Amazonian area more and more to oil. So I can't remember the second part of your question now. What was
the second part? Was then
What are the
How,
signs?
yeah, the signs that people can kind of recognize
Yeah.
when this does happen.
Well, you start a head of a country, the government of a country starts being accused of being communist or being pro-socialist, pro-Russia, anti-US in some way. We've seen that very strongly in Venezuela, and some of it's justified. There's always aspects that you can bring out. That happened with Zelaya in Honduras, that he was accused of being this anti-American socialist. He was a socialist, but he was not a communist, and he in no way advocated it. Both Torrijos and Roldos were accused of being pro-Soviet Union. Neither one of them liked the Soviet Union. As Torrijos once said, there aren't even any Russians in this country. Maybe it was Roldos. Maybe they both said, I can't remember. In both cases, there were very few, if any. And they made a point of that. And yet our press launched this campaign about how awful they were and how socialistic, or sometimes they're accused of being, too authoritarian, dictatorial dictatorships. So when these campaigns are launched in the United States and in many other countries, that's a good sign that it's in the works, and that's a very strong warning to these leaders and to their countries. And sometimes the hope is that the country itself, the opposition politicians will gain ground because the United States is being so adamantly opposed to the current leader that maybe it'll happen peacefully. But if it doesn't, the jackals will go in.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's something that you mentioned, where another failed attempt could be seen as the US's entry into Iraq, both times, whereby everything was tried the other way, the way with the least bloodshed, through economic hitmen. And if there is a leader who still sticks to their own way of doing things, shall we say, not that I approve of Saddam or anything like that, but he was someone who said, no, I don't care, bring the guns. And then it wasn't just the jackals that came, it was the whole US Army that came rolling through. But with that said, then it's still it's still not quite tangible, I don't think, for the listeners. As you mentioned that loans were given to these countries, but just to emphasize the point of, although the loans were given to the countries, what you mentioned last time we spoke is that maybe 60, 70, 80% of that loan doesn't even touch that country's soil. It's gone straight from the World Bank, the IMF, and goes straight into the pocket of US companies because of the structure of the contracts that were made. So even the moment the contracts are signed, when the country goes into debt after signing a contract for, I don't know, 40 billion, let's say, hardly any of that money actually touches the country's soil to help that country grow at all. And then you've got the element of, once the infrastructure is there, as you well mentioned, that they're so busy paying off the debts, the usefulness of that new infrastructure, of the ability to dig for oil and make use of oil, is no longer of any use to the country because they're in such debt. Now, how big of an impact did you have as an economic hitman? How many different countries were you involved with to help build that American empire?
Well, first of all, let me say your analysis of money not going to the country is 100% correct. Actually, none of the money went to the country. In the initial loan, none of it. It all went directly from the bank in, let's say, Washington, the World Bank, to the construction company of the engineering banks in wherever, San Francisco, Boston, Chicago, Houston, wherever they happen to be. The money just went directly.
Yeah.
Now, it would only get back to the other country because of bribes. And we had a whole system of legal bribes. We were very careful not to do anything that was illegal in terms of bribery. But what we would do is tell the president of a country, or whoever we were dealing with, the minister of finance, whoever, you accept this loan and your brother owns the John Deere franchise. We'll see to it that construction companies pay him a really good price to rent his John Deere equipment.
Yeah.
In other words, we'll pay $2 million for equipment worth $1 million. Normally you'd expect that at a time like that, a construction company would come in and say, "Hey, we're going to give you a lot of business, give us a discount." But in this case, we'd say exactly the opposite. And knowing full well that that extra money was a bribe, that the brother would probably pay his brother, the president or minister of finance.
Yeah.
It was not our business. What would happen? And there's nothing illegal about that. If anybody ever called us on the carpet for that, which they never did, but if they did, we'd say, well, we struck a bad deal. That's all. And we also gave a lot of scholarships to colleges. My company was located in Boston, a city with lots of colleges, and we have lots of influence in those colleges. And we would provide scholarships. We'd make sure that the children of the president and all of his friends got into one of his colleges, and we'd give them a scholarship, and we'd brag about this. We'd go to the Boston Globe and say, "Hey, last year Charles T. Main gave several $1 million of scholarships to kids in poor countries." And of course, we never bothered to say we gave the scholarships to the families that didn't need them.
I see.
But so that's the only way the money ever got back to these countries, was through these basically corrupt methods that, legally speaking, are not corrupt, but they are corrupt. They're terribly corrupt. They're just not part of our legal definition of bribery.
Absolutely. And it's if the same thing was done with the US and the military industrial complex, is it Halliburton that was Dick Cheney's company, whereby they get massive contracts where everything is X amount overpriced for the exact same reason. So
right. Well, think about this. Think about this. Then you mentioned Halliburton and Cheney, but Bechtel, prior to that, was George Shultz, who was Secretary of State, became president, and was also president of Bechtel. Before and after he was Secretary of State, and Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense of the United States and was the chief counsel for Bechtel, and the list goes on and on and on. So this revolving door of a corruption within our own system that's, again, illegal. So it's really not corruption.
No.
By definition, but it is corruption by according to the way it's used.
Yeah, greasy handshakes is probably what they'd like to call it, more than anything else.
Let's not forget the Bush family that owned a tremendous amount of oil. Let's not forget the Trump family.
No.
Let's not forget any of them. We can see this in all of them, and of course we're going through now some potential scandals around the Biden family. So it's and again, this sort of thing has gone on from time immemorial, but. In the 1970s, we Economic Hitman took it to new levels, where debt became such an important part of the policy. And for a long time, the military was put in the background. That all changed after 9/11. And of course, you mentioned Iraq, how we changed the policy. But I have to say, what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and elsewhere, there was tremendous pressure during the time when the military wasn't very involved. There was tremendous pressure by what we call the military industrial complex to get the military involved. And so since 9/11, we've now got these two systems working hand in hand, once again, debt and military.
Yeah.
We're seeing it with China's using similar approaches.
Yeah. And you mentioned 9/11, and if we look at the debt-based economy that was created around the military-industrial complex, it's essentially the same thing that you were doing as an economic hitman in foreign countries that's being done by US, for the US, on the US. But then how do we go from there in what we're now seeing, and what you've already mentioned is this debt-based slavery that was imposed / gifted by the US, World Bank, IMF on foreign countries, to countries waking up and realizing, hey, actually, this wasn't so good for us. The populace still lives in poverty. There's still this abject poverty wherever you go in these countries, to China coming in and essentially taking over. Now, from where I'm sitting, part of the reason that China got this is because both the US, the UK, and a lot of Western countries, so to speak, outsource a lot of their manufacturing and other things over to China to put them in a position where they can grow and build internally, which our countries just can't do. There's no industry really in the UK apart from banking. Engineering used to be massive, and you know, all my friends that work in engineering are looking for greener pastures abroad at this point in time, for the most part. How is it that China got into this position of power then?
Well, first of all, when I was an economic hitman, we had the Soviet Union and the United States vying. And if a country wanted to get a better deal from the United States, they would invite the Soviet Union in to make an offer. And usually they didn't want the Soviet Union. Very few countries really wanted the Soviet Union. Nobody really wanted to have a government like the Soviets. And the Soviets didn't really have a lot to offer. Their economy was pretty small. It was not, but they were a leverage against us. We were so fearful of the Soviet Union and the United States that we would then soften terms. After the Soviet Union ended in 1991, we were the only superpower. And we had an opportunity at that point to really try to advocate for democracy and a good form of capitalism. We had a tremendous opportunity. We blew it. Went in great greed. I'm talking we being the United States. I wasn't involved in it then, but the United States went in and we continued this terrible policy of exploiting countries. And it caused a lot of resentment in countries, but they didn't have anybody to turn to. And then suddenly China emerges. And really it was 2013 when President Xi came into power, and it had been growing, but Xi recognized an incredible opportunity here. He could go out to the world and he could say, look what China did. We brought over 700 million people out of poverty since the 70s. And we've had economic growth that's averaged just about 10% a year for 30 years. Nobody else has ever done that. During those same years, the United States did not experience an increase in the average wage when accounting for inflation. What we call the real wage did not increase. It has not increased since the 1970s. At the same time, the middle class in the United States has declined from 60% to 50% of the population. So China has this incredible opportunity that President Xi sees of saying to the world, well, which model do you want in Latin America and Africa? Do you want to follow the model of a country that's risen out of the ashes of the Cultural Revolution and become the second most dominant power in the world economically? Or do you want to continue with this American policy that's been exploiting you for all these years, demanded military bases on your soil, and the United States hasn't done very well, really, when you come right down to it, compared to China. So the China model becomes very, very attractive. China goes in, though, with the same economic hitman strategy, the same 4 pillars. And, but often they're offering better terms in debt. They've forgiven a lot of debt in much of Africa. And I'm not defending the Chinese approach at all. The economic hitman strategy is absolutely wrong and extremely detrimental to the world, regardless of whether it's practiced by China or the United States or Russia or anyone else. It, in fact, has created climate change. It's created what we call a death economy, an economic system that's consuming itself into extinction, based on short-term maximization of profits. That's the guiding principle. How do we make more and more profits based on incredible materialistic greed and exploitation? And we've got to end it. It's causing climate change. It's causing species extinctions, environmental destruction, income inequality. Those are all symptoms of a system that's been around a long time and has gotten a lot worse in the last in my lifetime. And we've got to end it. And my upcoming book, that's the approach I take. That China and the United States can disagree on everything else, but we have to agree that we're going to come together to end climate change, to end this death economy, or there really isn't much hope for human beings and for life as we know it on this planet, Sonny. We have to turn this thing around, because this system, one that I was a very instrumental part of expanding back in the 70s, is destroying life on this planet as we know it.
Part of where that email was kind of leaning into when I sent it to you, of the business dealings that we now see out of China and with Ukraine from Hunter Biden, for example, of the leaks from the laptop and whatnot. And it does lean into exactly what you've just said, of there are these politically backed things that are happening from US government, but then there are corporations going in there with US citizens sitting on the board or whatnot. How is it that we've come to this situation now where, like you said, it's no longer benefiting the public? These people are no longer there to serve Joe Average, with all due respect. You've got a couple of years less left on the planet than someone like myself. And for me, it looks like every year is a potential year where things are just going to go by the wayside. And more I see it in British Parliament, I see it in Dutch Parliament as well, that they're not looking out for our interests as the population. And how is it that we've come to this point?
Well, that's a really good question, Sonny. And, don't be too confident that you've got more years left than I do, because the way the planet's going right now.
Fair enough.
I worry, not to be too cynical, but I worry
that
we are truly in apocalyptic times, and the fires and the drought and the floods. I mean, it's all happening. And what are we doing? We're saying, well, we'll get things changed by 2040. The Chinese are saying 2060, or even 2030. It's too late. We've got to, but I understand. How do you, so here's the president of the United States, Biden, who's been very strongly anti-fossil fuels and pro the green movement. Now, suddenly he's negotiating with Saudi Arabia and trying to pick up the oil. And I understand why, because otherwise the economy is going to crash even more than it's already crashed, and it continues to crash. Very, very difficult questions here. But the fact of the matter is, and the pandemic and then this war in Iraq has taken us away from the most serious issue on the planet, the most serious problem, which is climate change. And actually, climate change is only a symptom, like species extinctions and income inequality. These are symptoms of what economists are calling a death economy, an economic system that's consuming itself into extinction, that's based on one goal, and that goal is to maximize short-term profits and short-term consumption, materialistic consumption, regardless of the social and environmental costs. That's the economic system that's been building. And I was, as an economic hitman, that was my job, really, was to create this system. We weren't calling it that at the time. We didn't even see it as that at the time. We were blinded to it. But now we understand it. And we were beginning to move away from it toward a life economy, an economic system that will pay people to clean up pollution, to regenerate destroyed environments, to recycle, to develop technologies that don't ravage the earth, that are truly zero-sum polluting, zero-sum waste conditions. We were moving in that direction, and now suddenly, with especially the war, but also the pandemic, we've taken several steps backward. And it's very, very scary. It's very scary for anyone your age, for anyone my grandson's age. He's 14 years old. I worry about the future, and it's my fault. It's my generation's fault. You guys are stuck with it. Look at it as a great privilege to have this challenge. You're faced with an incredible challenge, but you better face up to it, and you better be skilled at bringing us through this challenge.
Taking a bit of a sharp left there towards the climate change situation, as it were. And I mean, I know this is something that you are adamantly involved in and adamantly looking to create a sustainable future. And it's one of the things that I find really interesting, because as I see it, I know we've gone away from the economic stuff for the moment, but it does circle back. If we dump the fossil fuels, which I do think we should, but if we dump them tomorrow, we don't have the infrastructure, funnily enough, something which you're very well versed in getting people, we don't have the infrastructure to carry forward to the day after. We don't have the battery capacity. We don't have the energy production systems. So this is where I've been ultimately baffled at the lack of interest, it seems, in nuclear power. Because if we were to use nuclear power, the phrase that's used is the amount of uranium required to power it for my lifetime will be a Coke can sized of uranium in order to get that power going. So as someone who is as steeped in a sustainable future as you are, where do you see nuclear playing a role in that future? Because ultimately, solar farms destroy a lot of land in their production and the minerals required to get them. Wind farms are also known to whack out a couple birds a year, you know? So how can we utilize those natural renewables and something like nuclear? Do you think that that's possible?
Well, I don't think it's possible with the current technology. Whacking out a few birds or a few thousand birds or taking up this land is not comparable to what happens at a place like Chernobyl or any the other nuclear catastrophes.
Facilities. Yeah. Fukushima in the last
3 Mile Island. I mean, and how many others that have been that close that we don't know about. And I'm fairly familiar with that industry. It's also not economical at this time. And environmentally, it's pretty bad when you take into account all the materials that go into building those plants and so on and so forth. So I think there is potentially a future in new technologies. You know, there's people looking at small fusion generators, which would be wonderful if that were to happen. But at this point, as far as I know, none of those technologies are replicable on a scale that would serve us. So at this point in time, I don't think nuclear is a viable alternative, although it is occurring more and more in parts of the other parts of the world.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. With the energy crisis that's happening in Europe, everyone else's bills are going sky high, and the only place you can find within the EU that's not suffering and not threatening blackouts. So Germany are threatening blackouts, and Hamburg has even said we're going to have warming tent areas, essentially government buildings where people are going to be able to go to over the winter if it does get to that. The UK have said we're potentially going to get blackouts if it continues the way it's going. With, as you've already mentioned, the way that the weather is, things are a lot hotter. We're not able to store as much energy, yada, yada. France is the only place that has stayed quite low in their energy costs. And that's because of the fact that they have a large nuclear base for their power. So a lot of their power comes from nuclear, I should say, not just one facility. But yeah, so economically, there has to be some sort of payoff, because, you know, I wholeheartedly agree in the sentiment of what we're doing to the planet. It can't go on. We have this death economy where we have just lived to destroy it. It's not like the oldest civilizations whereby they lived not one with the land, but they knew when it was good agricultural land, when to move on from the land, what to do with the land, how much they could cut down without being too detrimental to the overarching ecology there. There has to be some kind of give and take there, right?
Yeah. So, yeah. What's the real question you're asking?
I suppose that fair point. The real question that I'm asking is, how much can we expect to suffer is probably a bit of a strong word. Suffer in the short term.
No, it's the right word. We've got to suffer. You know, we've made terrible mistakes. and we have to pay for them. The planet is demanding that we pay for the mistakes we made. The question is, are we willing to suffer in the short run in order to get ourselves into a position where your children and grandchildren will live in a viable world? Or are we going to keep putting this thing off and having the burden in their hands?
Kicking the can down the road, as it were.
Yeah, and that's what we've been doing. And that's what most of the world seems to be doing that now. It's, you know, oh yeah, we'll get this thing straightened out. We'll be net zero by the year 2050, 2060, 2070, whatever. That's too late. The suffering is going to be much, much greater. So yeah, we've got to suffer. It's you know, it's like sometimes, you know, you have to in the short run, you have to swallow the pill.
Yeah,
it's going to get you a little sick in the short run so that you will be healthier in the long run, kind of thing.
Break a few eggs to make an omelet.
Yeah, yes, we've made catastrophic mistakes, and we've blindsided ourselves to them for far too long. We were in denial about climate change. Large sectors of our population, at least, were in denial about climate change for a long time, even though it was pretty obvious that it was happening. The last president of the United States was in denial about that, you know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And now we're not so, I don't think there's hardly anybody in denial anymore about these problems. There are a few voices in the wilderness out there, but what we are in denial about is that we have to suffer in the short run. We don't want to suffer. You know, we're all in the United States right now. Everybody's all excited and upset because the stock market's going down. I have a retirement fund, you know, that's receding on me rapidly. I'm not happy about that.
Is it like my hairline then? It's
yes,
it's gone the way of the dodo.
Yeah, I've been careful to, you know, keep mine in place. But and I think that's a good analogy, that yes, we're going to have to suffer. Somebody's going to suffer. Is it going to be us, or is it going to be our children and your children and grandchildren, and my grandson and his children? I would rather that we get started soon. And I think you can say the same thing about nuclear. You know, right now, and I think nuclear is something that needs to be investigated more and more and more. It shouldn't be ruled out. I'm not at all suggesting that. But at the moment, I think we have to look at the short-term benefits that France is getting from nuclear and the possible long-term consequences of the you know, what happens to all the radiation once that plant closes down. How do you dispose of it? We still don't have good ways to do that, and that's a burden on future generations, no matter how you cut it. And again, you know, some of the new technologies seem to look as though they may be able to use up the waste or not create the waste.
Yeah,
that's very important, I think, for our research to look at. But again, it's this question of how much do we, if France solves the problem in the short run, is it creating a bigger problem in the long run? Is it creating the potential for some of those plants to malfunction, or human error is usually the big cause of these accidents? Ultimately, a piece of equipment may fail, but then how humans react to it is another issue. Do we have the competency to do that? Do we have the backup systems? Do we have now the AI technology may provide a lot of answers to some of these questions. The AI might have prevented Chernobyl or Fukushima or any of the other ones. We don't know for sure.
There's a lot to open up and unpack there, but I think one of the biggest bits that you mentioned at the end there, the climate change aspect, is something that, for me, I think is big enough to be its own conversation, because I do recognize that drilling for oil, the way that we are going for resources and the way that we are destroying parts of the world, in essence, in order to get at these resources, is absolutely dreadful. It's absolutely awful. There are better ways to do it. and we're exploiting the land in the worst possible way. We're destroying habitats, destroying nature. Now, you spend a lot of time in the Amazon, so you've probably seen a lot of the damage that's occurred there as well. So the destruction to land is one thing that I'm fully on board with. The temperature change aspects that's also brought into the question of climate change is something that I'm still on the fence about, given certain particular things. So I'd love to talk to you about that as well. However, we can circle back around to that, as your knowledge as well within the energy sector is something that I'd love to talk about on that aspect too. As we mentioned in the last chat that we had, which unfortunately I had technical issues with, the nuclear power element too. But you mentioned there the exploitation and the short-term maximization of profits. Now, for me, as someone who's not an economist, it sounds a lot like Friedman-style economics, where you privatize all the businesses and the CEOs work just to maximize profits. And the approach, as I'm familiar with it, from let's say the shock doctrine from Naomi Klein, is that the way that Milton Friedman justified it was by saying that if these businesses are profitable, all other aspects, i.e. Social qualities, environmental things, these things will all improve as well. Now, here we are, it's 2022, and we know for an absolute fact that that's kind of not what happens when companies go to maximize profits. They want to get sweatshops involved. If we take something like Nike, for example, they're not going for good quality, local sourced things. They're going for the cheapest possible alternative. Can you maybe talk to us about that switch also from Keynesian economics towards Friedman style economics, that Chicago style of economics, and how that also had an impact, and where both the US and Chinese economic hitman style of colonialization has adopted these methods?
Sure. Yeah. You're really talking about neoliberal economics. That's Friedman's, yeah. And it really took off when with Hayek, Frederick Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in economics a couple of years before Friedman, who won it in 1976.
Okay.
When Hayek came out of Austria, he came out of this tremendous fear of Nazism and big government, and so he very strongly promoted the idea of privatization, of getting government out of everything. And but he wasn't extremely well known. He did win the Nobel Prize in economics, but soon after him, and a collaborator with him was Milton Friedman, who was very well known and won the Nobel Prize in economics in '76. And had the ear of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and leaders all over the world. He traveled extensively all over the world promoting this idea of
neoliberal economics,
which basically says get government out of business, minimize or get rid of regulations and restrictions. Let private business take over, and let private business be driven by maximization of short-term profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs at the time. Because he actually said, as you mentioned, if we maximize short-term profits, that'll take care of social and environmental problems, which is crazy when you think about it. I mean, it doesn't make any sense from the go-get, and we've seen that it doesn't do that. This led to trickle-down economics, the idea that if you don't tax, and that was another aspect, don't tax the rich, because they're going to reinvest their money and create economic growth. Well, we've seen that just doesn't work. They reinvest their money and make economic growth for themselves. And of course, we can show, well, GDP's increased. Look at this. Friedman won the Nobel Prize in 1976. The U.S. GDP has increased a lot since then. But once again, as I said before, that really measures what the wealthy have done and the big businesses have done. And 70% of the business in this country, of all the income in this country, 70% of it comes through the Fortune 500 corporations. And many of them pay no taxes whatsoever. It's a disgusting system. And you mentioned China. Well, China comes along, and President Xi makes a big point of being opposed to neoliberalism. He says China developed the way we have. We had 10% economic growth for 30 years. We brought 700 million people out of poverty, dire poverty, and we've done it by opposing neoliberalism. We have put a lot of power in the hands of government. Many of our biggest businesses are owned, at least to a large degree, by government. There's a combination often of government and private. They're called SOE, state-owned enterprises. And we've taken care of our people. We're not looking at the short term. We have long-term plans. He says we're the opposite of neoliberalism. And that appeals today to a great many countries who are fed up with the US's imposition. It's not just the US, the NATO, European allies of the US get involved too. They're fed up with it, and they've seen it doesn't work in the United States very well. And furthermore, they'll say, and I hear this a lot, Sonny, if the United States is a democracy, we don't want it. It doesn't work. Your Congress can't agree on anything. They make no compromises. You have a president that comes along and changes all the rules that the previous presidents put into play, disregards agreements that were made. And so this whole idea of autocracy is taken over. And I'm very concerned about that the appeal of democracy is fading around much of the world. We're seeing it in Italy. Italy has made big news in the last week because of its turn toward the right and toward authoritarianism. And we're certainly seeing it in Russia. We're seeing it in many, many places partly because the United States has been such a bad model of democracy. It's not democracy that's failed us. It's the US model in recent years that's failed us.
I would go even further to that, to say it's okay, the US model hasn't helped, but it's the people that are there. It's the lifelong politicians that are there for 40 years or more that have no idea what it's like for the average Joe walking down the street. So they're making these policies, and maybe there's some malice in some of these politicians. Absolutely, that's a possibility. But I do think there's also politicians who there's no malice behind what they're doing necessarily. They're just too stupid to know that they're affecting people lower down the rungs. They really live up above in the clouds and don't see what's happening down below in the gutters. And when they hear something, they think, oh, it's just those few people complaining, not realizing that actually the majority of their society is living in poverty, having to go to food banks. They're healthcare workers, they're teachers, you name it. And I think for me, that's where a lot of people have lost faith in it. And I don't think we live in a democracy. If I'm deadly honest, and
Right.
You've seen things a lot worse, of course. And we're by no means North Korea, we're by no means Russia or China. But I don't think we live in a true democracy that's representative of the people, be that in the UK or in the Netherlands, where I am now, or even in the US. I think, it's just not. It's people, it's authoritarian people working to their own means, their own ends, and pretending it's still a democracy.
I totally agree. That's why, it's not that democracy isn't working. It's that the democracies that we know aren't working. It's the people, but it's also the system. So in the United States, we have this situation where every state gets 2 senators, and you can have a state with an extremely small population, very, very rural, all farmers, and they have certain interests in life, and yet they have the same power in the U.S. Senate with their 2 senators as a state like New York or California that's highly urbanized and has very, very different problems from those of farmers in the Midwest. And that's, to me, that's not democracy. That's not equal representation. That a state with a very small population has as much power in the Senate as one with a very large population. that's the opposite of democracy. That's giving a very few people a lot of power. And then in addition to that, of course, in the United States, at least, we have this, these laws that allow big corporations to basically bribe politicians. Nobody can get elected in the United States to a major position without a lot of money that comes from corporations, or it may come from individuals who made it in corporations. And so those individuals are beholden to the corporations. Again, it's this form of corruption, what we mentioned earlier, the revolving door, the fact that the George Shultz was Secretary of State and also president of Bechtel, and yeah.
Bush was on oil boards, then a president, and Dick Cheney's on X amount of boards. And if was it maybe in Confessions or maybe in The Secret History where you mentioned that he didn't even have to let go of his position? It kind of just fell by the wayside. The fact that he was on the board and he was meant to leave but got to stick about. Lucky boy. So if we bring this back to China, then they go into these countries and they're saying, listen, you can either go with the US and go with their method, go with their model, and you see how that's going down now. You see how cities are burning themselves apart and people are now telling you that they're a tree and all this other crazy stuff that's happening in the US, or, we can grow things for you. So how far has their reach gotten, and how likely is it that it's now becoming something encroaching on the US and Western Europe and their way of being? Because
they've done it.
Yeah.
It's not, will the Chinese win? They've won. At least they won the most recent battles, economically speaking. They are the #1 investor and trading partner on every continent in the world, including North America. The United States economy is extremely dependent on the Chinese economy for its many of its inputs, and also for its markets. And the Chinese are dependent on the US for its markets. So, but the Chinese have taken over. There's no question about it. And, I just finished this book that comes out in February, but it goes into China's Economic Hitman strategy. And it points out in the book that every single part of the world now is beholden to China, in economically speaking. And China, unlike Russia or unlike the Soviet Union, has a model that people can buy into. It's been extremely successful. It has the second largest economy in the world after the US, and by the PP economy, which is spending power parity, it's larger. In other words, their people have more spending power when you convert to their currency than we do in ours. But and it has another extremely powerful tool, and that is the perception that it offers the world the new Silk Road. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
And so it's saying that if you join us, you will become part of an international trading network. You will be an integral part of this new Silk Road. I taught in an MBA program in China not so long ago. And of course, the students, that program is constantly ranked as among the top 10 MBA colleges in the world, up there with Oxford and Stanford and Harvard and so on. And most of the students there had been handpicked by the Communist Party to be the leaders of the future. And they're very brilliant, and they're the future leaders. And it was very interesting to see how they looked at our two different systems and how much more compelling they found their system. And this idea of the new Silk Road was very, very important to them, that we are creating a trading network for the entire world. When Ecuador takes a big loan from us, we're going to use it to tie its roads in with Peru's roads and Colombia's roads, and we're also going to help it build ports to tie it in with the sea routes to Africa and Asia and all over. When I first learned about this, I thought to myself, my God, how brilliant. Why didn't we think of that? Because it's an amazing marketing tool. And ultimately, it serves China's interests very, very strongly because it ties them in even more with this trading network. But it's a wonderful promotional gimmick. And it's not just a gimmick; it is happening. So China has a great deal to offer other countries, and especially other countries that are fed up with the colonialism of Europe and the United States.
But then, are they not succumbing to a new type of colonialism with China?
Yes.
And
Yes.
how are people not realizing that? What is so different in China's approach that they've taken this soft glove approach that people don't realize that they've kind of snuck in the middle of the night?
Very important aspect is that we go in and we say, hey, take this loan from us, hire our companies to build big infrastructure in your project, in your big infrastructure projects in your country, and buy into the neoliberal economic system that we're proposing that privatizes business and takes government out of it. And China comes in and says, take these big loans from us, hire our companies to build big infrastructure projects that will help your country's economy advance. And we're not even going to try to impact your government, your policies. We don't care what your policies are. We don't care whether you're capitalist or democracy or communist or dictatorship. We don't care. And the fact of the matter is, the United States doesn't really care either. We say we do, but we support very undemocratic
Saudi
governments.
Arabia, yeah.
Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iran, in the past,
Iran,
and many others.
You put dictators in power, right?
We do.
With the Shah of Shahs, yeah.
Yeah. But China says we don't do that, and we're not going to do it. We're going to let you decide on how you want to run your country, and that's very attractive to these countries. So China's taken a very, very different approach to reach the same ends, which is to basically colonize the world and become the dominant power.
How is that country then beholden to China? Because when the US do it, when they put the Shah of Shahs in place, it was someone who was going to work with the US because of XYZ reason, because they've greased their palm, because they're paying, like you mentioned, their brothers, cousins, sisters, aunts, uncle, and all the rest of it, and got on their family into Cambridge, into Oxford, into Harvard, etc., etc. What is it that China's doing to ensure their cooperation of this foreign country? Because they're also far away.
Well, it's primarily debt. So they give these huge loans to these countries, and there's a lot of corruption that goes on there too. And China may not be directly involved, or perhaps it may be. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people then see themselves in those countries tied to China and to China's way. And the whole country is tied in with debt. I just mentioned Ecuador, and that's a great example. Ecuador basically got rid of all of its U.S. World Bank, IMF debt as much as it could in the past, and it's taken huge amounts of debt from China. But because it can't pay back those debts, China, under its contracts, China has the right to go in and drill for oil and to mine for copper. They've been building these huge mines out in the very fragile Amazon rainforest for copper, gold, cobalt, and other minerals. So it's similar to what we did, where we said, yeah, if you can't pay your debt, then let us take your resource. Yeah. And China's doing pretty much the same thing, and the countries are really powerless to accept this. And I should mention one other thing. So many of these countries, we're talking about lower income countries, Africa, Latin America, parts of the Middle East and Asia, have mineral resources of one form or another, but they don't have the technology to exploit those resources. And the United States does have the technology, and China has the technology, but they need to bring in some country, some company from some country like the United States or China to exploit these resources.
Yeah, they're engineers, they're economists.
Yeah. So that's the story.
If we park that for a second, one of the other big things that's occurred over the last few years is, you've already mentioned Europe, you mentioned NATO, the UN, and the World Economic Forum seems to also have an approach whereby they want to have people in charge, sort of like CEOs over the countries, rather than letting the countries have their own normal law and order, so to speak. And one of the things is that they've spoken up a fair bit about China, where you mentioned China selecting their people, their leaders for the future. The World Economic Forum has done this as well and put those people in positions of power, such as Justin Trudeau and his cabinet, Jacinda Ardern, Boris Johnson, even Liz Truss are all former young global leaders running out of the World Economic Forum. If we look at it like that, is that not similar in some sense to the economic hitman style of putting your pieces in play to then have control on the global stage, where as China does it, they're creating these links between all these different countries through the infrastructure. Where this has happened then with the World Economic Forum is through the leaders of the nations themselves. So Angela Merkel was another one. So basically most of Europe was a leader in some form or another, or close to the leader who was there, who could then dictate and help to push certain ideals in a particular way. And what that has led to, if you look at the UK, is Liz Truss is now taking out more and more loans. And that quantitative easing is only going to negatively affect the people in the UK, as interest rates seem to be bouncing up and down and the cost of living is going up. How then would you say that fits into the picture, and also fits into an almost planned demolition of the countries as they stand now?
So are you asking, how does China do that, or
no, as a third party in this, almost the World Economic Forum in cooperation with Western Europe for sure, and then CEOs in a sense utilizing the Friedman-esque control given to said CEOs of major companies. And then when you watch their global leaders that are in power almost imploding countries like Liz Truss and Boris Johnson have done to the UK in the last few years, and Liz in the last few weeks, how does that all come together to then help push these goals forward, to push these initiatives whereby countries are becoming further and further saddled with debt?
Well, I think, perhaps even more, it certainly puts all the countries at basically what we call the debt trap. So these countries are now put in a debt trap where they are beholden to the big banks and to the financial institutions around in those parts of the world where they work. But it also is something that other countries that are looking to develop, the lower income countries, will look at these models and say that's not working. And China, again, if we go back to China, China comes along and it's created all these various organizations. And there's the Southeast Asian organization. There's the one, they've created a huge organization in Africa where practically every African country, now 54, I think of them, have now signed on to this alliance. Basically, it's a trading alliance. It's not a political alliance, it's a trading alliance. China's been very successful at this. It's not insignificant. I was recently in Kazakhstan and speaking at a big economic forum in Kazakhstan, and many of the Chinese leaders were there. And I get to be friendly with Putin's top economic advisor, and there were, it was an amazing group of people. And Kazakhstan is perched to play a major role in the development of the new Silk Road as it comes out of China and expands into Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Kazakhstan is right there. It's like the linchpin, and it's not insignificant that Xi's first trip out of China and Hong Kong was to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan about a week or so ago, where he met with Putin. There, Putin came into China's territory, basically what China considers it's part of its territory, and so the World Economic Forum, it represents the kind of the neoliberal approach to economics, but China's countering that by developing its own versions of the similar types of forums or alliances, whatever you want to call them, coalitions of countries in every major part of the world to oppose neoliberalism, or at least on the surface to oppose it.
So even in that instance, it's as much influence and power as the World Economic Forum has created for itself. They're still having to vie for that power with China. Then that's interesting. But
well, also the World Economic Forum basically is creating the groundwork for big corporations to maximize short-term profits. That ultimately is their goal. It's neoliberalism, it's privatization, it's reducing taxes on the rich. You've just seen that in England, as you mentioned. That's something that the Truss has done or tried to do, and there's a backlash against it now. So it's implementing neoliberalism essentially.
Okay, and then you mentioned Russia there, and I'm cognizant that we're sort of running short on time as well. You mentioned also there's potential scandals now with Biden and Ukraine. How does Russia and Ukraine fit into this global picture in terms of the influence that it's had, not just economically, but the impact that it will have in terms of who, at the end of the day, comes out as the quote unquote winner, as it could go either way towards one or the other of the big powers, right?
Yeah, I think Putin understands that he's not a major power. He's not going to compete with China or the United States in a fair war. He can only be a disruptor, and that's what he's doing. He's disrupting, and he's trying at the same time to expand Russia. To he's gone on record as saying that one of the greatest catastrophes of the last century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So he's got several agendas here, but one of them is just to be a disruptor. And I think he, like Xi of China, they really want to get rid of U.S. hegemony in the world, the power that the U.S. exerts over the world. So from that standpoint, he's helping China, but it's also hurting China because this war and has very adversely affected supply chains, as we all know. Is having a big impact, a negative impact on China's New Silk Road policies. And the fact that China didn't immediately step in and defend a sovereign nation, Ukraine, is hurting China's reputation around the world. But at the same time, China hasn't actually really supported Russia. It hasn't not supported him, but it's taken a pretty mild stand. And I've got to believe that hearing what both Putin and Xi said after they met in Uzbekistan, that Xi is putting a lot of pressure on Russia to somehow end this thing, because it in the long run, it doesn't serve China's interests, except in the small area where it threatens U.S. hegemony, possibly. But in fact, it seems to be strengthening U.S. hegemony and the NATO alliance. So it's very disruptive. And from my standpoint, the worst thing of all is that it's taken all of our attention away from solving the world's biggest crisis, which is the death economy and climate change. And one of the major themes of my new book is that China and the United States can disagree on everything else, but if we don't come together and lead the world out of this death economy that's based on terrible exploitation of resources, if we don't lead the world out of this awful short-term economic system, we're doomed, or it seems as though we're close to doomed. Life as we know it on this planet is never going to be the same. We've got to put this behind us. We've got to put the economic hitman strategy behind us, regardless of whether that's implemented by China or the United States or Russia or anyone else. We need to move into a new era where we have to understand that we, human beings, have a huge responsibility to be good stewards on this planet. And we have not done a good job at that in ever. Well, that's not true. Indigenous people have done a very good job at it over history, taking care of their environments. It's that for the last decades, and perhaps you could go back a couple of thousand years to see the roots of it, but especially since World War II, we've done a horrible job of stewardship, and we need to change that.
I think that's a nice way to finish up there. And I'm also wholeheartedly with you on the indigenous folk have treated the land and everything better. When you look at farming practices and the way that they were able to maintain soil quality, nutrition and foods and the like, and then what we've done in the last 100 years, making the nutrient value of the foods that we eat less than 10% of what it was, and having to increase our calorie amount. I think it's something ridiculous, like to get the same value out of strawberries as you did 100 years ago, you'd have to eat 5 times as much, because we've just destroyed the soil and the nutrient factor of where it was all originally coming from. So in that sense, I'm wholeheartedly with you. And your experiences of going and doing your volunteer work during the Vietnam years, and seeing how things were done by indigenous tribes, I can only imagine the experiences that you've had there. But John, we got maybe 1, potentially 2 minutes left. What would you say would be the most important things for the listeners to keep an eye out on, or to look towards going into the future, aside from your book out in February?
That book goes into that a lot. It's called the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, 3rd edition, China's Economic Hitman Strategy, and how to end the global takeover. I think we live at amazing times. Anyway, I think we're blessed to be alive right now, because we truly are on the cusp, but we're perched at the edge of a precipice here. It'd be very easy for us to fall off that precipice. But it's also a good time to really reconsider what it means to be human on this planet. And I think every one of your listeners is in a position to really go deep into, what can I do that'll help transform this death economy into a life economy? And a life economy is an economic system that pays people to clean up pollution, to find uses for all that plastic that's out there, to regenerate destroyed environments, to recycle, and to develop new technologies that don't ravage the earth. We are at an amazing time, and it's a time to be very creative and hopeful and inspired to move forward into this new era, and to see to it that we do survive as a species in the long term.
Great. Thank you very much, John. Really appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll be able to speak to you again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks for all you do. Keep up your great work.